The number on the display was 31, and nobody in the room could explain it. 47 times the Vithrak conclave had run this simulation. 47 times the floor of the observation ward had filled with the smell of heat and effort and the low percussive sound of warriors in motion. The number at the end had never been this low. The record, before today, was 89. No orders had been called across the floor. No commander directing the line. No one telling the 50 cubs where to go or who to carry or when to fall back. They had done it anyway. Sira stood in the second tier, notebook open, pen not moving. She had been writing for 6 weeks straight in mess halls, in briefing rooms, in corridors where the stone walls ran with cold, and she had stopped now without deciding to. Across the observation deck, the Velsin military analyst had gone still. His mandibles, which had been clicking in low sequence since the simulation began, had stopped at minute 11 and had not started again. The Velsin did not go still. It was a species that communicated in constant motion, clicks and counterclicks, a running commentary of microassessment. Their stillness meant something had broken in the analyst's ability to categorize what he was seeing. Sira had noticed. She did not think anyone else had. On the platform at the far end of the ward, Cale Thorne stood with his hands behind his back and his eyes on the number. He had not moved in 11 seconds. She had counted. Then he said 4 words. She almost missed them. The part that matters most comes 6 weeks earlier. Stay close. The first page of her notebook said tolerated. She had written it the morning she arrived, before she had learned enough to write anything more useful. She had been trying to find the right word for the way Cale Thorne had looked at her during the formal welcome, not hostile, not curious, somewhere between the two, and tolerated was the best she could do. She had 11 words from him that morning. She counted them on the walk to the briefing room, because her hands needed something to do inside her empty holster. 6 weeks earlier, Toreth Station had appeared in the shuttle window as a shape rather than a structure, carved into the face of a basalt cliff, no exterior lights, no landing beacon. Just the rock, and then, as they came around the eastern ridge, a seam in the rock that was actually a door. The station did not want to be found. The shuttle pilot had remarked on this. Sira had written it down. The cold hit her before the door opened. Not temperature, exactly, pressure like the station was doing something to the air. She pulled her collar up. The holster shifted against her ribs, empty per the treaty's terms. She had been assigned as Galactic Accord Cultural Liaison, which meant she was the only human anyone at Toreth Station had ever seen in person, and probably the only one they expected to see again for at least 2 years. Her job was to observe, to document, to produce, at the end of her rotation, a cultural assessment that the Accord would use to calibrate future treaty terms with the Vithrak conclave. She had not been told she would end up on the training floor. Nobody had planned for that. The training ward was built for cold. Sira understood that on her first morning, the stone ran dark and wet along the lower walls, and the air near the floor sat a few degrees below the air near the ceiling, which meant the cubs trained in the coldest layer without anyone deciding they should. It was just how the room was made. 50 cubs in formation. The silence was the first wrong thing, because children this age should not be this still. She had worked with human trainees at Fort Amaris and with Quarethi cadets on the Veth relay station, and both species made noise, accidental noise, the kind that came from 50 young bodies trying to hold themselves in place. Shifting weight, cleared throats. These cubs made none of that. Corvin's voice was the only sound in the room. He moved along the outside of the formation with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times, calling corrections in a flat register that contained no praise and no comfort. Water breaks were timed. Eye contact with observers was prohibited. The cubs' faces stayed forward. Sira wrote without looking at the page. She had learned that trick in her second year of fieldwork. If she looked at the notebook, subjects noticed the act of being recorded and adjusted. If she kept her eyes on the room, they sometimes forgot she was there. She was trying to forget she was cold. The ward smelled of nothing. That was the second wrong thing. 50 gathered bodies should have produced a smell, biological warmth, effort, the specific scent of young animals in motion. The cold had taken it. The room was too cold for that, and the absence of smell made the scene feel like something preserved rather than something alive. On the far wall, rows of training hide records hung in sequence, long strips of cured material covered in clawmark script, dated in columns going back further than she could quickly count. Some of the oldest ones had turned dark at the edges. She noticed them without understanding what they were. Shivrek stood 2 tiers above Corvin, watching from the second platform with her arms crossed and her expression carefully empty. She had been introduced to Sira as the station's senior assessment officer, which apparently meant she watched and recorded and never said what she thought until she was asked directly. She was the one who had given Sira access to the morning session. She had not explained why. Elder Voskareth's name appeared in the briefing materials as the conclave's historical consultant, a position Sira had taken to mean ceremonial until she noticed the way Calethorn said the name. Slight pause before it. The kind of pause that meant the name carried weight the speaker was choosing not to show. She wrote Voskareth, ask about later. She did not ask, not then. The cub at the back of the third row was holding his arm wrong. She noticed it on the fourth pass, the way he kept his right arm slightly inward, the elbow turned at an angle that looked deliberate but wasn't. She had seen that angle before on humans, on Quarethi, on anyone who had learned to position a limb so the pain in it was distributed rather than pointed. It was the posture of someone managing something they did not want to report. His fur ran gold in the overhead light, lighter than the others by a shade that was visible from where she stood. He was not the smallest cub in the formation, but he stood as if he were, shoulders slightly in, space maintained between himself and the trainees on either side, the precise gap of someone who had learned that contact meant collision. She crossed the floor without thinking about it. Corvin's shout reached her before she made it halfway, a single sharp syllable in Vithrak that she understood to mean stop. She stopped. 50 cubs did not. They turned. Not all at once, it rippled, the way water moves when something falls in. The front row turned first, then the second, then the back rows, and by the time it reached the cub with the gold fur he was already looking at her, which meant he had started before the ripple reached him. He had been watching her for longer than she realized. The formation was not broken. They had simply rotated to face a different direction. But in 3,000 years of Vithrak military record, a formation had never voluntarily redirected without a command. Corvin's face was doing something complicated. Calethorn watched from the upper platform. He did not move. He did not speak. His eyes went from the cubs to Sira and then back to the cubs. The cubs were not afraid. That was the thing. They were curious, a specific and focused kind of curiosity, the kind that looks like alertness rather than softness. Several of them were watching her breath fog in the cold air. A small cub in the second row had been watching the fog for what she estimated was 3 full seconds now, and then snapped her eyes forward as if catching herself. Sira stood very still. She said, in standard because her Vithrak was 4 weeks old and mostly nouns, "I want to look at his arm." The cub with the gold fur looked at her. Then he looked at Corvin. Corvin said nothing. The cub looked back at Sira and extended his arm. The council chamber had 7 tiers and 6 commanders, and none of them looked at her for the first 4 minutes of the hearing. She had been given a seat at the lower tier, which she understood from the briefing materials meant she had been granted observer status rather than respondent status, which in turn meant they could ask her questions without being bound to record her answers. She found this clarifying. It told her what kind of meeting this was. The formal charge, as read by the scribe, was unauthorized contact with active trainees during formation exercises. Sira had anticipated this. She had prepared a response. The response was one question. She waited until the formal charge had completed, and the room had settled into the specific silence of officials waiting for an apology. She asked, who is tracking the injury rate for trainees on this floor? The silence that followed was different, not the silence of officials waiting, the silence of 6 commanders exchanging nothing through a look that passed too fast to follow. Nobody knew. She could see it in the second tier, a slight shift, a recalibration, the particular stillness of someone processing the fact that they do not have an answer to a question they should have an answer to. There was no manual for this. There was no precedent for this. There was no category in 3,000 years of Vithrak record for what the cubs had done when they turned without a command. And nobody had been tracking what happened to the cubs who couldn't keep up. Calethorn spoke from the upper tier. His voice was formal, clipped, each word placed with the exactness of someone who did not speak to think out loud. He said the hearing would be continued at a later date pending review of the liaison's observational mandate. He did not look at Sira when he said it. She wrote, "He gave me time." She wrote, "He doesn't know why he did that." The supplemental access grant came through 8 days later, 1 hour per day, conditional on prior notice to Corvin. The vote had been divided. She learned this from Shivrek, who mentioned it in the tone of someone conveying information rather than offering commentary. She asked Shivrek how she had voted. Shivrek said, "I voted in favor." She did not explain why. Sira did not push. Corvin filed a formal objection. In writing the morning, the grant was posted. He used the full ceremonial format, clawmark seal, triple fold, delivered by a station courier rather than through the internal system. The message was that he considered this process irregular and wished his position recorded. Sira had read the copy Shivrek passed her. She had written in her notebook, "He's not wrong." Cale Thorne had abstained. She had not expected that. She sat on the floor. This was the first thing she did in the first session, and she did it before anyone told her she could or could not. She crossed her legs, set her notebook on her knee, and sat on the stone floor of the training ward while 50 cubs stood at attention 12 feet away. Corvin stepped forward. From the upper platform, Cale Thorne raised one hand. Corvin stopped. The cubs watched her sit on the floor. She said in her 4-week Vithrak, which was mostly nouns with some verbs she was not fully sure about, "What do you want to be good at?" The question landed in silence. Not the trained silence she had learned to expect, something more uncertain. Several cubs looked at each other for the first time since she had been in this ward. The Vithrak language did not have a word for want in this context. She had found this in the briefing materials. The concept existed only in the context of physical need or tactical assessment. To want a thing for yourself, for your own development, because you had decided it mattered. There was no form for that. She had known before she asked. She watched the cubs turn the question over. It was visible on their faces, not confusion exactly, more like someone handed a tool shaped in a way they had never held. One cub near the center tilted his head. Another opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at his hands. The cub with the gold fur, Vel, she had learned his name from the intake records, said very carefully in standard. Good at what? His standard was better than she had expected. She wrote this down without looking at her notebook. She said, "That's the question." From the back of the second row, a low sound. Not a word. Something between a sound of confusion and the start of a laugh. The cub who made it caught himself immediately and went blank. Sira pretended not to notice. She had found, in 4 weeks, that this was one of the most useful skills she had brought to Torath Station. The fog from her breath moved in the cold air. The small cub in the second row watched it for 3 full seconds. By the end of the 3rd week, she had 6 data points she was not going to put in her official report yet. First, the injury log for the training ward covered equipment and environment, but did not track soft tissue damage to trainees. No column existed for it. Second, Vel had been managing what she was reasonably certain was a partially healed fracture in his lower right arm for somewhere between 4 and 8 weeks. Third, in 6 sessions with her present, the training ward's informal injury count. The small things she tracked herself because nothing else did was 0. Fourth, 3 of the cubs had started making eye contact with each other during rest periods. Before she arrived, the rest periods had been silent and individual. Fifth, Corvin had attended every session and had not directly interfered since the first morning. He stood at the edge of the floor and watched and wrote his own notes, which she had not been allowed to see. Sixth, Cale Thorne had come to the platform for 4 of the 6 sessions, and had stayed each time longer than the one before. She had written these 6 points in the back of the notebook, in the section she kept for things she didn't know what to do with yet. The obstacle ward was a different room, wider, lower ceiling, the floor divided into sections by stone barriers and suspended ropes, and a system of weight-bearing platforms she had spent 2 sessions just mapping. It was built for individual performance. Each section of it was designed so that completing it alone was the expected result. Corvin's documentation of his refusal was 3 pages, clawmark formal, delivered to Cale Thorne the morning of the first cooperative session. He argued that cooperative training runs against 3,000 years of established doctrine, that the cultural liaison's influence had already produced a hearing and a divided vote, and that the conclave did not require an outside opinion on how Vithrak warriors were made. He was not wrong about most of this. Sira had read the copy Shivrek slid under her door, and had spent an hour sitting with it before she started writing her response. Her response was 2 sentences. Cooperative efficiency data from 6 sessions. Injury count 0. Request permission to run 1 obstacle course variant with trainer Corvin present. She did not argue doctrine. She let the number sit by itself. On the morning of the session, Corvin was there. He stood against the far wall with his arms crossed and his face giving nothing away. He had brought his own notes. The large cubs failed first. She had expected this. The obstacle course had 3 sections that required coordination at different heights. A rope traverse that needed simultaneous anchor and movement. A platform sequence that collapsed if more than 1 point was loaded without the weight being distributed. The strongest cubs were the first to reach these sections and the first to fail them, because everything they had been trained to do said, push forward, use what you have, hold your ground. Vel's team reached the rope traverse 4 minutes after the first group. She had not assigned Vel to a team. She had said, Form groups of 5, your choice. She had watched the room rearrange itself, and Vel had ended up in a group of 4 others who had, she realized slowly, each drifted toward the part of the floor nearest him, not assigned. Arrived. At the rope traverse, Vel looked at the rope and the anchor and the 4 cubs with him, and he did something she had not seen a single Vithrak trainee do in 6 weeks of watching. He talked to them, not commands, not the flat corrective language Corvin used, not the assessment shorthand the cubs had developed with each other. He said, in a low voice she had to cross the floor to hear, "Your arms are longer than mine and your grip is better. You 2 anchor and I'll call the pace. The rest of us move when I say move." He had said, "I'll call the pace," not someone call the pace. He had looked at his own limitations and then organized around them, which was a thing she had not seen a single senior instructor do in this building in 6 weeks. The cub he had spoken to first looked at the rope, looked at Vel, looked back at the rope. Then he moved to the anchor. It took Vel's team 11 minutes. The group records, individually, averaged 47 minutes for this section. 3 of the 5 cubs from the first group had not finished at all. At the end of the course, the 5 cubs crossed the line within 30 seconds of each other, Vel last, because he had been calling pace from the rear, making sure the front of the line didn't outrun the back. The adult Vithrak, standing along the wall of the obstacle ward, did not move. They were watching something they did not have a word for. Sira stood at the edge of the floor with her notebook open and her pen in her hand, and she wrote nothing. Some numbers were better left to sit by themselves for a minute. 1547. Cale Thorne stepped off the platform. She noticed it before she understood what she was seeing. In 6 weeks he had stood above the floor the way the station itself stood above the valley, fixed, structural. A thing you oriented yourself around rather than a thing that moved. And now he was on the floor, walking toward her, his claws making a sound on the stone she had only ever heard from up in the tiers. He stopped beside her, not in front, beside. He looked at the line where Vel's team had finished. The 5 cubs now standing easy, breathing hard, not quite looking at each other and not quite not. Sira clicked her pen closed. She waited. He said, "This is not our way." She had learned not to fill his silences. She let it sit. After a moment he said, "The last engagement of the 4th campaign, 4,000 soldiers." Another pause. 4,000 trained warriors, 4,000 dead who followed orders perfectly all the way to the end. He was not looking at her when he said it. He was still looking at the line. She said, "What happened?" He said, "The orders were wrong." She wrote nothing. She turned the pen over in her hand once and put it in her pocket. The training hide was already on his desk when she came to his office the following morning. She had not brought it. She did not know who had. It was a long strip of cured material, the same type that hung on the walls of the training ward, the kind used for formal record. It had been folded in a hurry. She could see that from the doorway, the way the edges had gone stiff and uneven where the ink dried mid-fold. Someone had unfolded it and set it flat on the stone desk, and it lay there now, not quite smooth, resisting. Cale Thorne sat behind the desk. He had not touched it. 50 claw marks ran down the left margin in iron-dark ink. Small, careful, each one pressed to a depth that meant deliberate rather than casual. She recognized Vel's among them, lighter pressure, but the shape precise. She sat down, she looked at the marks. He said, "They have no formal standing to petition anything." She said, "They petitioned anyway." Silence. She said, "No legal category exists for a trainee petition, which means no rule prohibits one either." He turned the hide to face him without lifting it, a friction sound, parchment on polished stone. He looked at the marks the way she had seen him look at the simulation number, not reading, processing. He said, "What are they asking for?" She said, "They are asking you to see what you saw yesterday, in writing." He did not respond for a long time. She looked at the rows of training hide records on the wall behind him, the same kind, the same dark ink, the same column of dates going back further than she could count without moving closer. She had noticed them on her first morning in the ward and not understood what they were. She understood now. Each one was a record of what the conclave had decided to call true. He said, "I will take this to the subcommittee." She said, "All right." She stood, she left the petition hide on his desk. She logged it in her notebook as Exhibit C. Shivrek found her in the outer ward that evening. The outer ward was technically a transit corridor. Stone walls, no seats. The cold coming off the floor in the way it did at Torath Station. That specific ground-level cold that lived below knee height and reminded you it was there without ever quite becoming unbearable. Sira had found it was a good place to think, because nobody came here to do anything except pass through. Shivrek stood beside her for a moment before she spoke. She said, "I have been a trainer for 18 years. Sira waited. She said, I have never seen a trainee weep with relief. Sira looked at her. Shivrek said, after the obstacle course, Vel, when his team crossed the line. She paused. He turned his back to the floor first, so no one would see. The number 31 moved through Sira's mind, the number from the cold drop at the start of this, the number on the display that nobody could explain. She had not connected it yet. She wrote it in the back of her notebook and circled it without adding anything. She would understand what it meant in 11 days. Elder Voskareth arrived at Torath Station unannounced, one day before the delegation. She was eating in the mess when Shivrek came to the door and said his name. The room shifted, not visibly, just a slight change in the quality of how people were holding their bodies. She filed this away. He requested a private meeting. She followed a young aide through 2 corridors she had not been in before, and then through a door into a small room with no windows and a single stone table. The room was warm relative to the rest of the station, which she suspected meant it was used for formal conversations. Cold was Torath Station's default discipline, but certain things apparently required a different temperature. He was already seated when she entered. He was old. She had gathered this from the briefing materials, but had not fully prepared for what old looked like in a Vithrak elder. The fur had gone pale silver along the jaw, and he moved the way structures move when they have been standing long enough to have settled, slowly, without waste, each motion arriving exactly where it was needed. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. It was not an unfriendly silence. It was the silence of someone deciding how to begin. Then he asked, "Did you know we did this before?" She said, "Did what before?" He said, "What you are doing now, what the Cubs are doing now." He placed one hand on the table. 3,000 years ago, before the Great Severance. She sat very still. He said, "The records are not gone. They are in the lower archive. They do not use the standard indexing system, which is why no one looks for them." A pause. "I looked for them." She said, "What happened?" He said, "Tomorrow, after the delegation." He stood. The meeting was over. "I wanted you to know it existed, so that when I speak tomorrow, you will understand why I am the one speaking it." She went back to her room and sat on the edge of her bunk and looked at the wall for a long time. She wrote in her notebook, "He has been waiting for this." She wrote for how long? The delegation ships came in the morning, Quarethi, Velsin, Kethori, their hulls catching the early light in 3 different ways. From the landing platform she could see their approach, and for a moment the sight of all of them arriving at once made the thing she was part of feel larger than she had been keeping it in her mind. She was standing beside Calethorn on the platform. She looked at his insignia, the formal rank marks on his upper chest. They had been polished. She could see her own outline in them, distorted, small. She had never seen them polished before. She said nothing. Neither did he. The Velsin analyst from the pre-delegation briefing was in the first delegation. She recognized him by the mandible pattern, the specific rhythm of his clicks. He was already clicking when he stepped off the ship, a low running sequence that meant active assessment. He had been here before years ago. She had read the old reports. The Quarethi representative was named something she could not produce with a human mouth. She called her the representative in her notes, and the representative had 4 limbs she used for walking and 2 she used for everything else. And she moved through the landing area with the deliberate care of someone who understood that every step was being watched. Calethorn greeted them formally. His voice carried the same flat institutional register it always did. She was starting to hear the things underneath it. The holographic field activated in the main training ward, and the light changed. A warmth bloomed from the field that should not have been there. The room ran cold, always cold, but the holographic system put out a low heat from its projectors. And in the 2 minutes before the simulation began, she could feel it on the back of her hand. She kept her hand still, so she would not draw attention to the fact that she had noticed. 50 Cubs took position on the floor below. The delegation watched from the upper tiers. The old commanders watched from the second tier. Corvin stood in the first tier, arms crossed. Calethorn stood beside her. The simulation parameters appeared in the display. Standard engagement, standard formation, standard doctrine. 47 runs, the baseline. The holographic field populated, a simulated terrain, low obstacles, a target zone at the far end. The kind of scenario the Vithrak had trained for 3,000 years. Stand your ground, hold your line, move forward when commanded, each warrior alone in his lane. For 20 seconds, nothing happened. Then Vel raised one hand. No order had been called. No command had come from the platform. He raised his right arm, the arm he had been holding at the angle that meant pain for 6 weeks, the same arm he had extended to her on the first morning, and he raised it straight and steady at the level of his shoulder and held it. The formation breathed. It shifted not the rigid rotation of a command response, but something more like water moving when the current changes. 3 cubs from the left flank moved right. 2 from the center dropped back. The line did not break. It reconfigured. No orders called across the floor. No commander directing the line. No one telling them what they already knew. She watched Vel's arm stay raised while the formation settled around him, and then drop, a single precise motion, and the formation moved. 22 minutes. At minute 11, the Velsin analyst's mandibles stopped. The clicking that had run as a constant low sequence since he boarded the landing platform, the sound she had learned to hear as background noise, and then as data. It stopped between 1 second and the next, and the absence of it in the room was louder than the sound had been. She did not look at him, she looked at the floor. The simulated casualties mounted in the display above the field, the number rising and then, at minute 14, slowing. At minute 18, a cub went down in the simulation, and the 3 nearest moved to him before the tactical calculation had time to complete. They moved as if they had practiced this, as if there was a word for it, as if someone had told them the word mattered. The Quarethi representative chimed once, softly. One tone, clear and brief. The other delegates turned to look at her. She did not chime again. The number appeared in the display. 31. Cale Thorne did not move for 11 seconds. She counted them the same way she had counted his words on the first morning, standing in the corridor with her empty holster. The same number, different weight. The Velsin military lead spoke. She caught only part of it. Her Velsin was worse than her Vithrak, but the tone was clear enough. She heard the word for how and the word for again. Cale Thorne said very quietly, "So would I." She did not write it down. Some things were not for reports. Corvin was not in the observation tier. She looked for him and he was gone. She did not know when he had left. Nobody did. The deliberation was closed to her. She sat in the outer ward for 2 hours and listened to the cold. When the door opened, it was Shivrek. The trainees had not been dismissed. Shivrek said this without preamble. They were still in the training ward, still in formation, and they were talking, quietly, in low voices that she said the older instructors could not quite hear from the upper platform, which she suspected was deliberate. 3 months ago, speaking during formation was a punishable offense. Sira went to the ward. The cubs were standing in the same positions they had held during the simulation, but the rigid spacing had softened. They were close enough that if one of them shifted weight, the next would feel it. A small cub in the back was saying something to the cub beside her, and the cub beside her was nodding, and neither of them was watching the platform. Shivrek crossed the floor and stood in front of them. She said, "You performed well." Her voice cracked on the last word. She did not acknowledge it. She kept her face still. Nobody in the room said anything. The cubs looked at her, and several of them looked at each other, and the silence that followed was not the silence Sira had walked into on her first morning at Torath Station. Elder Voskareth spoke last. He poured water from the stone pitcher on the table, lifted the cup, took one sip, set it down. He did not touch it again for the rest of the speech. It sat at the edge of the table, full, cooling, a cup of water nobody drank. He said, 3,000 years ago, we trained differently. He let that sit. He said, the records in the lower archive use a different indexing system. I have spent 11 years reading them. He looked around the room. We did not abandon the old method because it failed. We abandoned it because grief required punishment. The room was very quiet. He said, we lost something in the 4th campaign. Soldiers we had trained for 20 years, people we knew by name. And we were not able to say that what we felt was grief, because we had no form for grief inside the doctrine. He paused. So we called the grief a philosophy. We called the hardness a doctrine. We built the training system around the idea that if you did not attach, you would not lose. He looked at Sira. We did not fail, we did not forget. We decided that forgetting was safer. She wrote nothing. She had stopped writing 20 minutes ago. He said, the humans have a word for what the cubs did on that floor. I asked our liaison what it is. A pause. She said together. The vote was unanimous. Cale Thorne's full claw mark on the formal acknowledgement took longer than the others. Not because he was slow, she watched him without appearing to watch him, a skill she had spent 6 weeks developing, but because he pressed with his full weight, the way you pressed when you meant a thing to be permanent. She did not watch the pen lift from the page. 3 months later, she was told through the formal channel, Vel was reclassified. The role had been created specifically for his skill set, tactical coordination, pace calling, formation management. A role that had not existed in the Vithrak Conclave's record for 3,000 years. It had been there before. They had taken it out. Now it was back. She read the notification twice. and then filed it in the back of her notebook with the 6 data points she had never put in her official report. Her last evening at Torath Station, she went to the outer ward. She had her kit packed. She had filed her report, the official one, 47 pages, careful and measured and built from the things that could be verified. The petition hide had been logged as Exhibit C. She had the reference number. She sat on a stone bench she had never sat on before, and she opened her kit, and she found the petition hide folded at the bottom, stiff at the edges where the ink had dried mid-fold all those weeks ago. She looked at the reference number in her notebook. She crossed it out. She took the petition hide out of her kit and held it for a moment, 50 claw marks in iron-dark ink, small and careful. Someone had folded it in a hurry. The edges caught the light from the corridor behind her. Outside, the cold was the same cold it had always been at Torath Station, a pressure before a temperature. She had stopped pulling her collar up against it weeks ago. She heard footsteps. She looked up. Vel stood at the entrance to the outer ward. He had come alone, which was new. 3 months ago, he would not have moved through the station without the buffer of distance and space that protected him from contact he hadn't decided to have. He looked at the petition hide in her hands, and then at her face. He asked, "Will you stay?" She said, "I have a report to file." He said, "I know." A pause. He asked anyway. She stood. She folded the petition hide back along its original creases, the uneven ones, the stiff ones, the fold lines that had set in the shape of a hurry. She put it in her breast pocket. She could feel the unevenness of it through the fabric of her uniform. She walked out into the cold.